Bald zogen zwei Grenadier, die waren in Russland gefangen. Und als sie kamen ans deutsche Quartier, sie ließen die Köpfe hangen. Da hörten sie beide die traurige Mehr, dass Frankreich verloren gegangen. Besiegt und geschlagen das tapfere Heer und der Kaiser gefangen. Da weinten zusammen die Grenadier, wohl ob der kräftigen Kunde. Der eine sprach, wie weh wird mir, wie brennt meine alte Wunde. Der andere sprach, das Lied ist aus, auch ich möchte mit dir sterben. Doch hab ich Weib und Kind zu Haus, die ohne mich verderben. Was schert mich Weib, was schert mich Kind? Ich trage weit besser Verlangen. Lass sie betteln gehen, wenn sie hungrig sind. Mein Kaiser gefangen. Gewähr mir, Bruder, eine Bitt. Wenn ich jetzt sterben werde, so nimm meine Leiche nach Frankreich mit, begrab mich in Frankreichs Erde. Das Ehrenkreuz am roten Band sollst du aufs Herz mir legen. Die Flinte gib mir in die Hand und güt mich um den Degen. So will ich liegen und horchen still, wie eine Schildwache im Grabe, bis einst ich höre Kanonengebrüll und wehende Rosse getrabe. Dann reitet mein Kaiser wohl über mein Grab, viel Schwerter klirren und blitzen, viel Schwerter klirren und blitzen. Dann steig ich gewaffnet hervor aus dem Grab, den Kaiser zu schützen.
Thank you very much. From the late William Warfield, a board member of the Schiller Institute, brilliant poet and artist who would have great insight into the events unfolding today. Welcome to the Friday New York Symposium with Diane Sare. I'm Diane Sare, LaRouche independent candidate for U.S. Senate against Chuck Schumer. And what was brilliant about William Warfield's performance of this piece is his recognition. The composer obviously understood the humor. Why is it funny? Because you're dealing with people who have become romantically obsessed and lost sight of what their mission is as human beings. And we are seeing that unfold before our eyes right now with the unbelievable barrage of wartime propaganda that we're being hit with in the West. And I have to say, of everything I've seen, this takes the cake. From the New York Times headline, Moscow blocks Facebook and clamps down on free speech. Now, I thought of every news organ that could say this, I guess CNN. I mean, first of all, probably almost everyone who's listening to this program tonight has been thrown off of Facebook at one point or another, temporarily or permanently. The President of the United States has been banned from Facebook and Twitter, and the New York Times is going to denounce Moscow for clamping down on quote unquote free speech, because we all know that Facebook is the great epitome of free speech in the universe. Now, we're going to have to really do some thinking and ennoble the American population and the world's population to see our way safely through this crisis, because the propaganda is thick and furious and it's very ugly, and many people are getting taken in and confused really against their will. I would like to remind everyone that Helga Zeppler-Roush of the Schiller Institute put out a call a few days ago for convoking a conference to create a new strategic architecture based on the principles of the Treaty of Westphalia, which ended the really 150 years of religious war in Europe, and which also contains within it Lyndon LaRouche's 4 laws, because fundamentally what is behind this crisis, which has really nothing to do with Ukraine at all, except it's being used by people in this Anglo-Dutch establishment to be ground up as a way of destroying Russia and ultimately China. But the issue is to return to a sane principle of physical economy. And I do think that we may be getting close to this whole thing really backfiring on the lies and the liars, certainly in the United States, maybe more. I was just reading today that the approval rating of President Biden is at a whopping 41%. That's probably slightly inflated. 29% of the American people believe that our nation is headed in the right direction. So clearly, over 2/3 of the population don't think that World War III is the way to go. And Congress has a 22% approval rating. We are seeing the price of gasoline go through the ceiling. We're going to have shortages of fertilizer because of the sanctions on Russia. Crucial experiments in space are being shut down. Dmitry Rogozin of Roscosmos announced that Russia will stop selling rockets to the United States, and he said that if we want to get somewhere, we can fly there on our broomsticks. So this is really what we are doing. If we persist in this, is going to have a boomerang effect and be very, very damaging for the United States and Western Europe in terms of oil, petroleum, fertilizer, food, and for nothing. Russia is not our enemy. Putin did not do anything underhanded. He was very explicit, very clear that Ukraine joining NATO was a red line. Ethnic cleansing in the Donbass was a red line. He has been saying that for years, and that was ignored. So you have to ask, what was the intent? They had to know the result. And apparently, another genius, Mike Pompeo, presidential wannabe, went to Taiwan, and there he's calling for the United States to recognize the independence of Taiwan. So as we know from Great Reset Davos initiator Klaus Schwab, one of the things that absolutely must be stopped is poverty eradication, because he said, unfortunately, getting people out of poverty requires the use of fossil fuels, and we can't have that. Now, from the Senate, and again, indicating the insanity of people, Senator Lindsey Graham today put out a tweet. Is there a Brutus in Russia? Is there a more successful Colonel Stauffenberg in the Russian military? The only way this ends is for somebody in Russia to take this guy out. You would be doing your country and the world a great service. So now we have members of the US Senate calling for the assassination of the head of state of a nuclear superpower. If our Senate were sane, if Chuck Schumer had 1/2 of an ounce of moral fiber, they would be demanding that Lindsey Graham be thrown out of the Senate. And similarly, Roger Wicker, the nuclear bomber, who is soon to become the ranking minority leader on the the Defense Committee. Dennis, you can remind me. But at any rate, he's replacing Inhofe, who's stepping down. Wicker was the fellow who said just a few months ago that everything should be on the table, including the first use of a nuclear strike. So we have total insanity coming from the US Senate, which is probably why the approval rating is down around 20%. of our Congress. I also want to share a letter which was sent out from Peter Gelb, the manager of the Metropolitan Opera Company, who had precipitated a strike when COVID began because he told the orchestra and the singers that they should take a 30% pay cut and it would never be restored. He said in perpetuity. This ensemble is one of the finest in the world. It is very hard to put together an orchestra like that. They are paid very well, but musicians work hard and should be paid well. So now what has he done? Has sent a letter. Someone in the Metropolitan Opera shared this with me. He says, "Dear members of the company, we have issued the following statement on social media regarding the war in Ukraine. The Metropolitan Opera opens its heart to the innocent victims of the unprovoked war in Ukraine and salutes the heroism of the Ukrainian people. We stand in solidarity with them and urge the leaders of the free world to support them in their hour of need. We shed tears for them, including their brothers and sisters in Russia, who are also victims of the lies and propaganda of Putin, who seems intent on the destruction of Ukraine, its people, and all personal freedom in Ukraine and Russia." I guess no one in the US would know anything about that. "As an international opera company, the Met can help ring the alarm and contribute to the fight against oppression. While we believe strongly in the warm friendship and cultural exchange that has long existed between the artists and artistic institutions of Russia and the United States, we can no longer engage with artists or institutions that support Putin or are supported by him. Not until the invasion and killing has been stopped, order has been restored, and restitutions have been made. We stand in solidarity with Ukraine, its brave leaders, citizens, and artists. We dedicate the rest of our season to their courage." So no more Russian artists, no Anna Netrebko, no Gergiev, no, none of them until after restitution has been made for Russia in launching this unprovoked war, all of which is a lie. It absolutely was provoked. If you consider the murder of 14,000 people in the Donbass, 14,000 civilians, including thousands of children, which no one in the West had anything to say about. And further on these standards, the United States occupied Afghanistan for 20 years. Biden just stole all of their central bank money from the New York Federal Reserve and decided to divide it arbitrarily on his part between the 9/11 families and some as yet to be announced relief organizations. 7 million children are about to die of starvation. We are creating a concentration camp without walls, but no one should censure the United States. And God forbid anyone point out that the United States doesn't have freedom of speech or doesn't have freedom of elections, as I'm experiencing with my independent campaign, where suddenly I require 45,000 signatures in 6 weeks to get on the ballot. I'm so glad that the United States is upholding the torch for freedom. Now, on this inflation, remember Biden said that Americans would be willing to sacrifice to go to war with Russia. So get ready, Americans. We can have gasoline at $12 a gallon and starve to death, but don't you want to do it in order to really stick it to Putin and destroy Russia? Really, really sick. Now, what I wanted to talk about is how did we arrive at this point of really complete insanity? Oh, and one other thing. 16,000 mercenaries are reported to be on their way to Ukraine to help fight. 3,000 people have applied for visas or whatever you get from the United States. Apparently, the American contractors in Ukraine have already joined this war, and I will say on the side of the Nazis, because that is what has been the dominant factor in the Ukrainian government since Barack Obama overthrew the elected government of Ukraine in 2013 and 2014. And that was done under the counsel of none other than Christopher Steele of the famous Steele dossier, then with the MI6, who wrote dozens, close to 100 letters, apparently to Victoria Nuland, advising on what should be done in Ukraine. And there was a huge revival of the fascist Banderist movement, and these people are really unabashed. They're making videos to this day bragging. One group called C14 said, well, just because everyone we beat up or kill or torture happens to be Russian or Jewish doesn't mean that we're neo-Nazi. I mean, we understand it might look that way, but don't call us Nazis. So this is what we're supporting. And now you even have Germany sending weapons to a Nazi-infested regime to fight Russia. So consider how that looks and consider what is happening. What I wanted to just look at is what happened in 1989, what led into that. Because as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has said many times, this was an incredible opportunity for mankind, and we blew it. It was squandered. Now, people are aware, I've mentioned many times, that Lyndon LaRouche was the architect of the Strategic Defense Initiative, Reagan's proposal, Reagan's policy announced March 23rd, 1983, of developing laser technology to prevent nuclear warheads from striking the Earth. And the point of this was to end Kissinger's doctrine of mutual and assured destruction. And the fact that Reagan adopted this created the conditions where not only could the Berlin Wall come down non-violently, no bloodshed, but that Germany could be reunified. And in fact, Lyndon LaRouche, even after he had been indicted by Robert Mueller in Boston in 1987, was able to travel to Berlin with his wife, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, to give a press conference at the Kempinski Hotel calling for the reunification of Germany, knowing that the economy of the Soviet Union was going to disintegrate, as he had warned them in 1982 when they rejected Reagan's offer for cooperation on the SDI. Many people thought, including myself, I was a student at the time, I thought it was most unusual for an American presidential candidate to be running across the planet calling for the wall to come down, something I knew very little about, but it didn't seem very practical or plausible. At any rate, the witch hunt against LaRouche continued. He ended up in prison in January, Mozart's birthday of 1989, but November of that year, the Berlin Wall came down. And that movement was rather extraordinary if you think back to it, because what was reported from East Berlin is that the population really was ennobled, that they would go to plays by the great German poet Friedrich Schiller, and certain sections of the play the people knew by heart, like the Rütli Oath and Wilhelm Tell. And when the actors would start reciting it, the whole audience would join in, very similar to what happened with Verdi's music in Italy. The Ninth Symphony of Beethoven, with words to Schiller, all men are brothers, that surely in the heavens a loving Father must dwell. This idea became the theme of this revolution. It was elevated, it was ennobled, it was human beings wishing good to one another and embodying that principle of children of God, men and women in the image of the Creator, and a general love for mankind. And Mrs. LaRouche and Lyndon LaRouche proposed that you take this moment to re-industrialize, to take the industrial power of Germany and spread that to the East and lift the Eastern former Soviet economies into a modern industrial functioning, as well as Russia, all the way from Portugal to Vladivostok, to develop the entire Eurasian landmass. Well, Alfred Herrhausen, the head of Deutsche Bank at the time, definitely also had this idea, and he ended up assassinated. And then what you had were a series of wars. The first invasion of Iraq already in 1991, the invasion of Panama, which became in December of 1989, just a month after the Berlin Wall had come down. What you had was an effort to destroy that optimism. And then what came from people like Jeffrey Sachs and others was shock therapy to stop the development of the East and instead to impose the British free trade system of looting, so that Russia's population began shrinking by 1 million people per year due to alcoholism, drug addiction, and just a general collapse and a massive increase of black market activity. So the moment when you had a population which was truly ennobled and optimistic and could have really moved to change the entire paradigm of human relations was squandered very, very willfully. And you'll remember George Bush Sr., I'll never forget hearing his whiny, asthmatic voice saying, "You won't see me dancing on the wall." Margaret Thatcher opposing the reunification of Germany, and then Margaret Thatcher talking about putting steel in Bush's spine to get him to go to war with Iraq after we gave Saddam Hussein permission to invade Kuwait. And then just one decade later, the events of 9/11 and another collapse into depravity and degeneracy. So we're at a point where this system is going to fail. In the meantime, happily, and this is what Klaus Schwab is attacking, China, under the leadership of Xi Jinping, has very much moved in the direction that Helga Zepp-LaRouche had proposed in 1996. In 2013, they initiated the One Belt, One Road in Kazakhstan. This project now has 150 nations. It is the most massive infrastructure building ever undertaken in human history. They have built tens of thousands of kilometers of high-speed rail. They're building new nuclear power plants, desalination plants, coal-fired power plants, with the idea of stabilizing nations through eradicating poverty. And this is exactly what Klaus Schwab seeks to stop. And I'll just say, going back to 1990, when Dick Cheney went from being a member of Congress to Secretary of Defense, there was a policy debate about the role of the United States in the changed world now that the Soviet Union no longer existed in that form. And what was determined is that the United States should see to it that no nation ever surpassed us economically, culturally, scientifically, etc. Now, that would be a stupid enough policy if the United States had a commitment to scientific progress, as we had under Kennedy when we landed a man on the moon. If we set a very high bar and we said we want to lead the world, I think it's a little selfish and egotistical to think that no one should ever surpass you. But nonetheless, if we were going to have a high bar of leading mankind very much for the better would be one thing. But instead, what we were doing was completely destroying our economy, worshiping Mother Earth, shutting down electricity, shutting down industry, attacking blue-collar workers and telling everyone they should become rich and learn how to rip people off on Wall Street, and that was the thing to do. So we were destroying ourselves and then said no one should surpass us, which meant that we were going to impose an even worse and even lower level on other nations. And somehow China, now with 1.4 or more billion people, managed to get very advanced. They've lifted 850 million people out of poverty. As I said, they've got 150 nations working with them, and Russia and China signed a very important agreement on February 4th on the sidelines of the Olympics, saying that there should be relations among nations such that no policy of one nation would jeopardize the security of another nation. China supported Russia's right to not have NATO encroach on its borders, Russia's territorial integrity. Russia supported China's the one China policy, that Taiwan is part of China, and they agreed to all kinds of collaboration in space and science, energy, etc. So this is what is perceived as the threat. This is what we're intending to fight. Unfortunately, I think maybe Zelensky believes somehow that the West really intends to help him. It would be good for mankind if he and the Ukrainian people would recognize there is no intent there, and all these mercenaries running over there are just going to be ground up for nothing as collateral damage in the effort to destroy Russia, as I said. So we have to change this policy dramatically. And I wanted people to have a fuller understanding of the history of this. So I've asked two of my colleagues, Carl Osgood from the intelligence staff at Executive Intelligence Review, who does a lot of work on military intelligence and history, and Dennis Speed, whom you know as my co-moderator. And we'll go right now to Carl. Good evening, Carl. Can we hear you?
Yeah, can everybody hear me?
Good.
Okay, great. All right, well, what I'm going to do here, as soon as I can see it here, is I'm going to go through something that Vladimir Putin raised in 2020, but that nobody else really wanted to take up, which related to the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. Because understanding the truth of what actually happened in the lead up to World War II, 1938, particularly that period in Eastern Europe, he made the truth about that prehistory of the war particularly important. There was a drive actually that began in 2019 to blame the start of the war on Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union alone, with the signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1938, discounting everything that had happened before, going all the way back to the Versailles Treaty. These same revisionists were also attempting to put the full credit for defeating Nazi Germany into the hands of the US and Britain, not even mentioning the Red Army, which was responsible for inflicting 70% of all the casualties that the German army suffered in the war. So Putin wrote an article. It was based on the Soviet archives, which were being opened up over the last few years. This was published in the American magazine, The National Interest, in June of 2020. He presented his analysis of the causes of that horrendous disaster for mankind, with his own call for urgent measures today to prevent the current crisis from ending in the same disaster, which in the age of thermonuclear weapons could end civilization as we know it. In doing so, he documented through the Soviet and other archives from that era that it was particularly the failure of British and Polish leaders, abetted by the failures of the Allies in general, to confront Adolf Hitler's ambitions in Eastern Europe, and not the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of August 23rd, 1939, that set Europe on the path towards war. It is a repeat of the tragedy of the 1941-1945 war between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union that Russia today is seeking to prevent. And that is what is behind the special military operation now ongoing in Ukraine, which is to destroy the neo-Nazi formations that have dominated Ukrainian politics since 2014 and prevent the US-UK dominated NATO from using Ukraine as a battering ram against Russia in the way that Hitler used Czechoslovakia as a lever for his ambitions towards Eastern Europe and the Black Sea. Now, when Putin did this, the Polish political elites of today, as well as NATO-aligned political leaders in other countries, erupted in howls of protest, insisting that what Putin argued in his article was not true, that Hitler and Stalin together were responsible for the start of World War II, and that only Hitler and Stalin were responsible for making Poland the first victim of the war through the 1939 division of Poland. But in fact, American diplomats had understood it at that time in 1937-38 that anti-Semitic violence and government legal actions akin to those in Germany were a huge problem in Poland, and reported that reality back to Washington. American diplomats also understood that Czechoslovakia was key to Hitler's plan for occupying Eastern Europe, and that Poland stood in the way of defending Czechoslovakia's sovereignty, because Warsaw was also eyeing a piece of that country's territory. These same diplomats also knew that Neville Chamberlain's British government planned to sell out Czechoslovakia to Hitler months before it happened, demonstrating that there would be no anti-Hitler coalition. All of this documentation that I'm referring to now, not in the American archives, has been available for decades, but it is ignored by those revisionists of today, some of whom have even posited that the US and the UK alone defeated Hitler, ignoring the fact that the vast majority of the war was fought within the Soviet Union and 27 million Soviet citizens died defeating this Nazi scourge. Putin wrote in that article, that June 2020 article, the blame for the tragedy that Poland then suffered lies entirely with Polish leadership, which had impeded the formation of a military alliance between Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, and relied on the help from its Western partners, throwing its own people under the steamroller of Hitler's machine of destruction. The Soviet Union did its utmost to use every chance of creating an anti-Hitler coalition, despite, I will say it again, the double dealing on the part of Western countries. Putin is concerned that there are signs today that the world could blunder into a war yet again. The creation of the modern system, this is Putin now writing, the creation of the modern system of international relations is one of the major outcomes of the Second World War. Even the most insurmountable contradictions, geopolitical, ideological, economic, do not prevent us from finding forms of peaceful coexistence and interaction if there is a desire and will to do so. Today, the world is going through quite a turbulent time. Everything is changing, from the global balance of power and influence to the social, economic, and technological foundations of societies, nations, and even continents. In past epochs, shifts of such magnitude have almost never happened without major military conflicts. Without a power struggle to build a new global hierarchy, thanks to the wisdom of the farsightedness of the political figures of the Allied powers, it was possible to create a system that was restrained from extreme manifestations of such objective competition historically inherent in the world development. It is a duty of ours, Putin continued, all those who take political responsibility and primarily representatives of the victorious powers of the Second World War, to guarantee that this system is maintained and improved. Today, as in 1945, it is important to demonstrate the political will and discuss the future together. It was in this regard that Putin reiterated his call for a five-power summit among Russia, China, the US, the UK, and France, which would discuss the issues of preserving peace to include not only security matters and arms control, but also to take up the situation in the global economy, particularly with regard to the coronavirus pandemic. But the direct trigger that led Putin to writing this article was a resolution that was voted up in the European Parliament on September 19th, 2019, which put equal responsibility for the start of World War II on Hitler's Germany and the Soviet Union, as if it began with the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed 1 week before the Nazi invasion of Poland. So this is a quote from the resolution. Whereas 80 years ago, on 23rd of August, 1939, the Communist Soviet Union and Nazi Germany signed a treaty of non-aggression known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and in its secret protocols divided Europe and the territories of independent states between the two totalitarian regimes, grouping them into spheres of interest which paved the way for the outbreak of the Second World War. So it followed that by saying, as a direct consequence of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, followed by the Nazi-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty of 28th of September 1939, the Polish Republic was invaded first by Hitler and 2 weeks later by Stalin, who stripped the country of its independence and was an unprecedented tragedy for the Polish people. Later in the resolution, the European Parliament claims, Russia remains the greatest victim of communist totalitarianism, and that its development into a democratic state will be impeded as long as the government, the political elite, and political propaganda continue to whitewash communist crimes and glorify the Soviet totalitarian regime. The EP therefore calls on Russian society to come to terms with its tragic past. The EP is therefore deeply concerned about the efforts of the current Russian leadership to distort historical facts and whitewash crimes committed by the Soviet totalitarian regime, and considers them a dangerous component of the information war waged against democratic Europe that aims to divide Europe, and therefore calls on the Commission to decisively counteract these efforts. Amazingly enough, the EP resolution never even mentioned the Munich sellout of Czechoslovakia. Putin, during a Commonwealth of Independent States Heads of State Summit on December 20th, 2019, told the assembled heads of state that he was surprised and somewhat hurt by the EP resolution. He said that the EP reference to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact begged the question, was this the only document signed by one of the European countries, back then the Soviet Union, with Nazi Germany? It turns out that this was not at all the case. He proceeded to list a series of agreements European powers signed with Nazi Germany from 1934 on, beginning with the declaration of the non-use of force between Germany and Poland, followed by the Anglo-German Maritime Agreement of 1935, the joint Anglo-German Declaration of Chamberlain and Hitler signed on September 30th, 1938, and several others involving France, Lithuania, and Latvia. Putin wrote, thus, the treaty between the Soviet Union and Germany was the last in a line of treaties signed by European countries that seemed to be interested in maintaining peace in Europe. Later in his remarks, Putin highlighted the role that Poland played in the pre-war geopolitical maneuvering in Eastern Europe, particularly with respect to Czechoslovakia, using documents from the Soviet archives. He referred to a conversation with French President Edouard Daladier, as recorded in one of these documents, in which Daladier said he saw no reason in Franco-Polish alliance. He saw no reason in a Franco-Polish alliance and the sacrifices that France was making as part of it. Putin said, so what does this mean? It means the Soviet Union was ready to help Czechoslovakia, which Nazi Germany was going to rob. But the agreement between the Soviet Union and Czechoslovakia stated that the Soviet Union would do this only if France fulfilled its obligations to Czechoslovakia. France linked its aid to Czechoslovakia to support from Poland, but Poland refused to provide it. The next document that Putin referred to reported that as Germany was laying claim to parts of Czechoslovakia, Poland also laid claim to their part of the prey during the partitioning of Czechoslovak territory and demanded that a certain part of Czechoslovakia be transferred to them. Moreover, they were ready to use force. They formed a special military grouping called Silesia, which included 3 infantry divisions, a cavalry brigade, and other units. In fact, the part of the territory that they seized was the northeast corner of Moravia, which occurred on November 1st, 1938. Not surprisingly, the response from the Polish government to Putin's remarks to the CIS summit and his remarks to the Russian Defense Ministry Board a few days later was one of complete hysteria. In a statement issued on December 21st, 2019, the Polish Foreign Ministry wrote, we are concerned and disbelieving to note the statements made by representatives of the Russian Federation authorities, including President Vladimir Putin, about the causes and course of the Second World War. They allude to the propaganda messages of the Stalin totalitarian era, already condemned even by Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Now, the fact is, and it takes a little research to actually discover this, but it's anybody can do it because the documentation is available, that in fact, U.S. diplomats knew what U.S. diplomats knew at the time was in fact coherent with what Putin is reporting in his national interest article. I reviewed 75 pages of documents that were published in the 1938 volume of the Foreign Relations of the United States, which is the U.S. State Department's official history. These 75 pages were titled Analyses and Reports of the General Political Developments in Europe Affecting the Maintenance of International Order and Preservation of Peace. These documents showed that American diplomats knew in general Hitler's intentions towards Czechoslovakia, that Poland had designs of its own on a portion of that country, about Britain's policy of appeasement of Germany, and that the Soviet Union really was the only country that might potentially defend Czech sovereignty. Central to this is a diplomat by the name of George Messersmith. He was the Assistant Secretary of State in 1938. In a lengthy memorandum that he sent to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Messersmith pans the notion, which was apparently current in Europe at the time, that Hitler might actually intend to abide by the agreements that he had signed. He said, I have myself never been able to understand why these illusions should persist when Hitler himself, in his book and in the statements which he has made privately and semi-publicly, has never left any doubt as to his political practice, according to which agreements are valid only as long as he believes they should be kept. It would seem that recent events should therefore convince a certain group in England, which has been fostering such agreements, how utterly futile and fatal is any idea that they may have, that they can make lasting and binding agreements with Germany under present conditions. And yet there would seem to be indications that English policy is more than ever oriented in the direction of such agreements. And he was referring here to both German designs on both Austria and Czechoslovakia. On February 21st, William Bullitt, the US ambassador in Paris, reported that the French foreign minister, Yvonne Delbos, told him that the British government had made it clear that Britain would do nothing to prevent the absorption of Austria by Germany. France could not alone attempt to protect Austria. It was clear, therefore, that Austria within a very limited time would fall into the hands of Germany. It would then be the turn of Czechoslovakia. Bullitt wrote that Delbos showed me a note which he had just received from Chamberlain, the British prime minister at the time, in which it was asserted that there would be no change in British policy. He commented that this note was, of course, valueless. The fact that England had embarked on a policy of turning over Central and Eastern Europe to Germany in spite of her obligations under the League of Nations. So it was clear to American diplomats that British policy was actually to facilitate German ambitions in Eastern Europe. On March 2nd, the US minister in Prague, a man named Carr, reported that Edvard Beneš, the president of Czechoslovakia, believed that Germany will want to negotiate, and he is ready to negotiate within the framework of complete loyalty to England and France, who would be informed of every step, and the reservation that the negotiations shall not involve intervention in Czechoslovak internal affairs. Given what Delbos had told Bullitt a little over a week earlier, this seems to have been a forlorn hope. The next day, March 3rd, Sumner Welles, the Undersecretary of State, reported that the British ambassador in Washington told him that Chamberlain had instructed the British ambassador in Berlin, Sir Neville Henderson, to seek an audience with Hitler to ascertain two things. The first of which was Germany's colonial ambitions, and the second, the precise extent and nature of Germany's attitude with regard to a permanent Central European appeasement. Biddle, the US ambassador in Poland, reported on March 12th that his sources in London and Paris, that what Henderson reported back to Chamberlain was that what Hitler wanted in Central Europe was a free hand for Germany and Austria and Sudetendeutsch. Sudetendeutsch meaning referring to the German-speaking portions of Czechoslovakia. There are many more documents that develop this situation as I've just described it, but there are two documents which are particularly prescient. On August 17th, the American chargé d'affaires in London, a man named Herschel Johnson, reported on a conversation he had the night before with the Russian ambassador in London in what he took to be the official Soviet Foreign Office view of Germany's objectives in Eastern Europe. What Johnson wrote was that the picture that the Russian ambassador drew for him is also of interest as part of the background, which, provided this account is a sound one, must presumably have great influence on the mind of Hitler in any decision he will have to make regarding the solution of the Czechoslovak question. For according to this theory, if Hitler loyally accepts a peaceful settlement between the Czechs and the Sudetendeutsch for a regime which will fully maintain the sovereignty of Czechoslovakia as it now exists, he will have to accept the most serious single impediment to Nazi plans for German expansion in Southeastern Europe. According to Monsieur Maysky, the Russian ambassador, the dispute with Czechoslovakia is being used as simply the opening wedge in Germany's struggle for continental domination. If Hitler succeeds in mutilating Czechoslovakia and reducing what is left to a position of political and economic vassalage, he will have opened the door to the creation of a solid bloc of states extending to the Black Sea. He will thereby have gained access to Romanian oil and the wheat fields of Hungary, which will make Germany largely self-sustaining. Furthermore, Czechoslovakia is out of the way the Danubian and Balkan countries will be. Furthermore, with Czechoslovakia out of the way, the Danubian and Balkan countries will be unable to resist the pressure which Germany will bring to bear upon them, Maysky said, Johnson reported. That Hitler envisages the inclusion of Hungary, Yugoslavia, Romania, and Bulgaria in a strict customs union with Germany to be further implemented by military conventions designed to give the German General Staff complete control of their armies. Maysky believed that Germany would not stop at that, but the question was, would Hitler go east or go west? To go east could only be directed at Russia, which Maysky thought was unlikely, at least not for the next 5 to 10 years, by which time he believed that Russia would be ready for it. Instead, he thought Germany would turn on Belgium and the Netherlands next with their rich colonial possessions. Maysky's idea that Czechoslovakia is the key to the whole situation in Central Europe is, of course, shared by nearly all commentators, Johnson continued. The idea that Maysky was working on, however, was that as far as Germany's future plans are concerned, it is not so much a question of whether she attempts to settle the Czechoslovak issue at once by force or whether she accomplishes the same purpose by other means. It is in the accomplishment of the purpose that the danger of the future lies. The danger to the future lies. He was emphatic in expressing his conviction that Hitler should not be allowed to destroy Czechoslovakia, and that the time to prevent that destruction was now. At the same time, he said efforts should be made by Western powers within the limit of possibility to lessen the growing burden of dependence on Germany, which is now falling on the Danubian countries, none of whom want to be sucked into the German maelstrom. Now, in a memo a few days later, following the receipt of Johnson's cable, the diplomat that I mentioned at the beginning of this section, Messerschmitt, wrote to Hull that the Russian view of German intentions should not simply be dismissed. He writes, and I quote, "There might be a tendency to minimize the views expressed in this telegram coming as they do from a Soviet ambassador. I would like to say that in my opinion, I believe that the Soviet ambassador has given a fairly correct view of what the real German objectives are. I base this opinion on my long experience and considerable personal contact with leaders in the present German government. The objectives which the Soviet ambassador has attributed to the present German government accord with those which I have heard high-ranking officers of the German government express to me directly or by implications from time to time." Now, Messerschmitt was indeed qualified to make such judgments. He had been in the U.S. Consul in Berlin from 1930 to 1934, where his main claim to fame actually was that he was the diplomat who approved the visa for Albert Einstein, allowing him to come to the U.S. In 1934, Messerschmitt became minister to Austria, where he stayed until going back to the State Department in 1937. So he was certainly in a position to know the thinking of the then present German government. So he writes, "The emphasis which I believe the Soviet ambassador places upon the importance of the German objectives in Czechoslovakia is not too great. The first part of the comprehensive German program involves domination of Austria and Czechoslovakia so as to open the way to Romanian oil, without which Germany cannot make war, as well as its free access to the raw materials and agricultural products of Southeastern Europe. The first step in the German program is domination of Southeastern Europe, as this is necessary if any further progress is to be made. This is the reason why I considered and have considered for the last 4 years that the German objectives in Czechoslovakia are definite and unalterable. If Germany should accept any solution of the Czechoslovak problem, which does not give her domination and control of that country, her whole program for expansion in any direction is stopped." At the end, Messerschmitt wrote, "I am convinced that Czechoslovakia has for Germany a primary importance, and that if she fails in her objectives there, it means a stoppage of her whole program. As the present regime cannot change any of its objectives without its whole program falling down, and as the Czechoslovak objective is among those the most vital, I see no let up on the pressure on Czechoslovakia and the danger of war over this question constantly present and not to be minimized." So I think it's fairly clear there that to any reasonable person who actually looks at this documentation, that in fact, not only was Putin's article historically accurate about the roles of Britain, France, and Poland in the fall of Czechoslovakia to Germany, but also that American diplomats knew the same, pretty much the same things. So with that, Diane, I will turn it back over to you, but I'm ready to answer any questions that people may have.
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think right now we're going to go to Dennis Speed. Let me just say, because there are many people watching on Facebook and YouTube, that the 45,000 signature requirement in New York is serious. We need hundreds of people to help collect these signatures, and you can sign up at sareforsenate.com, and I'll put that in the Facebook comments and YouTube comments. before you all lose attention, but I hope you don't, because this is an extremely important discussion. So with that, I would like to introduce Dennis Speed.
Thank you, Diane. 89 years ago, on March 4th, a speech was given that changed the United States. It was given by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And the actual day was a Saturday. So technically, I guess the actual anniversary will be tomorrow. But the day was March 4th. It was the day of the inauguration. Roosevelt had just survived an assassination attempt about 3 weeks earlier, which happened in Florida and which was thwarted because a woman in the crowd deflected the shot, not enough to stop the mayor of Chicago, Mayor Sare of Chicago, from being killed by it. But FDR was not killed. And as a consequence, when he gave that speech that day, as he was sworn into office at the Capitol, putting his hand on the family Bible, Dutch Bible, going back several centuries, it was open to the 1 Corinthians 13. Though I speak with the tongue of men and of angels and hath not charity, I am as sounding brass or tinkling cymbal. When he spoke that morning, the United States changed forever. We want to refer to the opening of that speech. He said, I am certain that my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency, I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our nation impels. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly, nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. I am convinced that you will again give that support to leadership in these critical days. I think we could argue that we are in precisely that circumstance tonight. And on Monday, we did not hear such a call from the President of the United States. We heard something unintelligible from the President of the United States, but that was the product of the extraordinarily incompetent deliberations that have been going on in the United States State Department and in the United States military on evaluating the actual circumstances that confront this nation as we meet tonight. There is no Ukraine-Russia war. That is a shadow war. What there has been is a decision that there will no longer be economic development in the world. There will no longer be not only an attempt to lift people out of poverty, but there will be a campaign to impoverish the world, starting, by the way, with you. Starting with this country, starting with Europe. And in order to do that, to introduce that impoverishment, you must introduce war as a reality in the same way that disease as a reality has been introduced into your lives. That people are told to accept the idea that an uncontrolled, mutating, deadly pandemic, which under certain circumstances could even be capable of wiping out 20-30% of the population, should be simply considered to be as part of what we live with. And war, yes, in your neighborhood, in your nations, will be what you will also live with. There's been a kind of funny process, which we'll probably refer to. We have a few examples from hysterical press, primarily in Europe, describing how the fact that the victims this time have blonde hair and blue eyes makes it really real. It's not like the uncivilized people that have been subjected to wars before. This is really serious. And when you see that kind of mentality, you understand why this set of civilizations may lack the moral fitness to survive. You don't have the leadership quality of someone like Franklin Roosevelt. Let's take, for example, this character, Roger Wicker. We're not going to spend a lot of time on him, but he's not unimportant. I mean, he had previously served as the chairman of the National Republican Senatorial Committee. He serves on the Commerce Committee and so on. He's not speaking just for himself when he says that there should be a threat to use nuclear weapons against Russia. Now, this sort of thing, especially as we look at what happened this week when the French finance minister used the term financial nuclear weapon against Russia, and that the intent was to destroy the Russian economy, he found himself the immediate, shall we say, object of attention of the former president of Russia, Medvedev. There have only been two presidents of Russia since the 1999 period, Putin and Medvedev. And Medvedev responded and stated, "Watch your words, gentlemen, because financial wars suddenly turn into real wars." But he had real wars in quotes because, of course, what is recognized by Russia is that World War III has been begun. It has begun. You are in it. The fact that you're not dead, it doesn't mean that you're not in war. Sort of like September 1st of 1939 until approximately January, February of the next year was called a period of the phony war. That there had been a declaration of war, but in September, but there had not been any action. And so the notion was, oh, well, this isn't really so serious. Of course, you ended up with 27 million people dead in the Soviet Union and perhaps as many as 70 to 100 million people dead around the world by 1945. So those people who were claiming that the war was simply a phony war were, of course, fools, deluded fools. In the same way that people right now that try to claim that this is a Ukraine-Russia war are fools, deluded fools. And there's importance to understand why that's the case. That's the case because of the inferior culture that has been practiced in the United States, sometimes called from the old days the rock, drug, sex counterculture. It's blamed on that. But actually, that inferior culture was beginning before 1945, really by the time of 1900. But that goes too far afield from what we're here to talk about tonight. What we see when we look at Lincoln Center, for example, that statement, that's just an exposure of the fact that Lincoln Center has always been a political animal run by what was called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. That's why it was begun as a center. That's why they hollowed out that area where blacks and Hispanics and Italians lived, just carved it out, nearly destroyed everything there. And they built it as part of the Cold War. That's what it was, and that's always been what it was. And the promulgation of various forms of modernism, particularly in the realm of music, was done as a way of countering the dictatorial control and authoritarian outlook of communism. And that's where you got the various waves of weirdness, which we don't have the time here to talk about either, in culture. That inferior outlook is what is right now placing us in danger, because people like Blinken and others, Victoria Nuland and others, they don't have any kind of efficient cultural background to understand what the actual matters are that are at issue here. With respect to what Lindsey Graham had to say, his call for assassination of Vladimir Putin. The poet Heinrich Heine, whom we introduced to you at the beginning, he's the author of the Two Grenadiers, the Biden Grenadier that you heard, the song that you heard at the beginning. Heinrich Heine once wrote, "Mark this well, you men of action. You are, after all, nothing but the unconscious instruments of the men of thought." So all the people that are talking about, the mercenaries that are going and the other people that are going to show up and the people who are really going there to defend the freedom of are just the instruments of the men of thought. And who are they? Well, they're not really men of thought exactly, but they have an agenda. That's Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, Mike Bloomberg, former mayor of New York City, who's UN special envoy on climate, and of course, Prince Charles, and others. And their view is they're going to depopulate the globe. What we are describing in terms of what Vladimir Putin, in the article, which was just gone through by Carl, is this is a real historical study, which is this kind of historical study which the Schiller Institute, which Helga Zepp-LaRouche founded, was based on. Friedrich Schiller was a poet like Heine, before Heine, and arguably Germany's greatest poet. But he was also an historian, and he gave a lecture called "For What Means and to What Purpose Do We Study Universal History?" His own studies of the 30 Years' War, and then actually other historical studies, which I won't try to reference, were done in order to try to understand how that fratricidal conflict, which killed almost 1/3 of the people in Europe, was ultimately ended, but also, more importantly, the character of the people that were plunged into it. And I think what we should, in conclusion, what I want to say is it's important for us to think tonight about the solution, which does not lie in any of the realm of what's called politics. You'll never get a solution if you try to go from the bottom up in politics, particularly the kind of dirty, corrupt politics of today, or economics, as people talk about it. There's no solution there. And if there's no solution, by the way, war is inevitable. That is to say, the hot phase, the phase that comes to you, the phase right now is in Ukraine and Russia, but then will be all over the world, and you will find yourself in it. You will be stumbled into it unless leadership is able to overcome that nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror that paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat to advance. So that's kind of where we are tonight. I think the other thing just to reference concerning the wicker idea, Heine once said, "When the heroes go off the stage, then the clowns come on." And in American politics today, when we look particularly at the Congress, that's simply, bring on the clowns. That's why they have the rating that they have, because everybody is clear that that's basically what you've got there. What's needed in the United States today is independent voices coming from the people, usually with no endorsement whatsoever of the establishment, that are capable of rallying the people of the United States to think of how to implement what needs to be done. And what that is an alliance with China, Russia, India, and other countries for economic development, a rejection of the idea of depopulation, a rejection of the idea of austerity, a rejection of the idea that scientific progress, particularly involving advanced energy systems, not solar and wind, no, but nuclear and nuclear fusion, as well as the massive use of fossil fuels in order to get the transition to those other forms of non-fossil technologies, such as thermonuclear fusion, that promise that energy becomes too cheap to meter, which is what, in fact, we thought we were going to have in the 1950s as a result of the Atoms for Peace process. So it's this that's needed. And what's important, I think, about the candidacy of Diane, and also the kind of report that Carl gave, is these are independent voices, which if you can reproduce them yourself, by taking what you're hearing tonight and getting it out in various forms becomes very, very important to do. So I think I'll stop my remarks there, and I have a couple of questions myself, but I'll leave it because Diane, you may want to have something to respond with respect to what Carl said, or maybe there are other questions that have come in.
Sure. Well, I wanted Carl to just say why what he went through is so important for right now, what that has to do with this, because people may be thinking, I don't know if it's occurred to people how really offensive it would be to, for example, not recognize Russia's role in defeating Adolf Hitler, for example, and what that would have to do with what's happening today. Putin had been rather clear about the two invasions of Russia, of Napoleon and Hitler, and how that might affect his thinking. I also, in response to what you just said, Dennis, would ask people here to consider that the United States has not had combat on our soil since the War of the Rebellion, misnamed the Civil War, which was again the British Empire attacking our republic. That was outside of the lifetime of anyone in this discussion. Maybe people had grandparents whose parents told them about it or something like that. But it's very distant, so it's hard to imagine a major city being destroyed in war. But that is where we're headed, or simply the economic effects. People find it unimaginable. LaRouche warned for some time that the result of our policy trajectory was going to be shortages of food, of fuel, breakdown, and everyone said, oh, you're exaggerating. That will never happen. They, the infamous they, would never allow that to happen. Well, I would say think again. And it's this thinking of what are the consequences of not changing your behavior, which would result in people doing something ennobled or idealistic, like signing a treaty that says we will each act henceforth in the interest of the other. That is not outside of the realm of possibilities, but we have to actually face where we're headed first. So, Carl, maybe you want to say something about that.
Well, I would just, to start with, I think I would observe on the economic side that I've seen the price of gasoline in my hometown just went up 30 cents this week. So the idea that it can't happen here, it is happening here. And this is not like previous times when the price of gasoline spiked. There's no chance under present conditions that it's going to come back down. And all that's happening at the same time that various kinds of basic food items are disappearing from the shelves of the grocery store. So it is happening here, and it's not Russia's fault. It's the collapse of the system, as you've been describing. Now, on why this history was important, I asked myself that same question today. I mean, Putin article, as I noted, was preceded by these claims about the beginning of World War II that were intended to blame Russia for the cause of the war, while ignoring Russia's role in the defeat in the end of the war, the defeat of Nazi Germany, and also to ignore this massive destruction and suffering that went on within the Soviet Union as a result of the German attack. Entire cities were destroyed. I mean, Leningrad, what see at St. Petersburg now, was laid waste. Stalingrad was laid waste. That's Volgograd today. 2 million people died in the Battle of Stalingrad over a period of about 5 months. So this is just an unimaginable scale of warfare before there were nuclear weapons. So why do we want to get the history straight? Now, I can't say I've worked this through all the way, but it's a so I'm going to be thinking out loud a little bit here, but it helps to set up the notion that Putin, the man, the demon, the Beelzebub, is responsible for what's happening now. By saying that this is how the Russian monster behaves. That's what that's the impression certainly that I get from this, and I think that if people understand the real history, what actually happened, they'll understand that then this is actually the same Hitler and the Nazis were were a British Empire project. And what is happening today is a British Empire project. It's the same thing. Ukraine, in a certain way, is playing the same role for the Anglo-American War Party that Czechoslovakia did for Hitler in 1939. So this is what's being set up. And the inevitable result, without the ennoblement of large numbers of people, will be the same, except that it will be with nuclear weapons. And that'll be the end of civilization. So that's how I would answer that off the top of my head.
Good. Dennis, why don't you go ahead with what you had?
Well, we got a question. I don't know if you got this also, which actually this came from Jose. He asked, for me and you, could you explain the significance of Paul Robeson's relationship to Russia and why that might be important to revisit today? I could say a few things about it. Robeson, born in 1899, I believe, maybe 1998. Robeson's father had been, was very active. They were from Princeton, New Jersey. He was himself very, well, basically the family was an enslaved family at one point. But, well, actually, let me say a little bit differently because make it clearer. The Robesons of Princeton were distinguished by their intellect and by the way in which they interacted. I should say that the great grandfather was a proprietor, sort of ran as kind of a tavern and restaurant during the American Revolution, Philadelphia. And so the family had roots in the Princeton, Philadelphia area for a period of a couple hundred years. His brother, Paul's brother, was unable to go to Princeton. He was prevented from going there because of the racist policy that blacks would not be allowed to attend. And that was enforced by Woodrow Wilson, who would later become the president of the United States. He was at that time the head of Princeton, and wrote a rather infamous history of the United States, arguing for a kind of parliamentary system, replacement of the congressional system by that. And later, of course, Woodrow Wilson would refound the Ku Klux Klan from the White House. That Klan was refounded by the use of the Birth of a Nation film. And that Klan had between 2 and 4 million members. And that Klan was not primarily based in the South. About 16 to 18% of its members were Southerners. The rest came from Indiana, Ohio, Massachusetts, Maine, and so on. And it was not simply an anti-Black organization. It was anti-Catholic. It was anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. It was against immigrants, and involved all sorts of people of all kinds of prominence. And this was something that Paul Robeson himself imbibed. By the time he was, there are many things to say about him as a person. The most important thing to recognize about Robeson was his extraordinary command and desire to command languages. He spoke fluently between 16 and 20, but he sang in another approximately 15 to 16 languages. He did many things in his life. He had the most impressive football record at Rutgers University of anyone really up until recently. He was a lawyer, but he became an actor and was discovered as a singer by accident when he was in a certain play, The Emperor Jones, in New York. So Robeson became political when he went to England, and he was there at the time of a strike, of a coal miners' strike. And the coal miners from Wales walked from Wales to London in their protest. But the Welsh coal miners had a tradition of singing. Robeson was coming out of a theater where he was appearing in Showboat. The song Old Man River was written for Paul Robeson. And he met the miners who were going down the street and they were singing, but he could see they were very, very poor. and he fell in with them because he was interested in the fact that they were clearly poor, but they were clearly happy, but they were protesting and they were going to the parliament. And as a result of that, he donated a railroad car of food and other supplies to the coal miners. And in this context, he became politically active. He later did many things. It's important to know that in the United States in the 1940s, he was probably one of the closest collaborators, though at some distance, but in fact a collaborator of Eleanor Roosevelt, and was very important at the time of the founding of the United Nations. Now, he was associated with the Communist Party. He was never a member of the Communist Party, but he did emphatically support the Soviet Union. And importantly, in 1949, when there was about to be a use of the atomic bomb, there was something that was being actively described called Operation Drop Shot. It was a plan that existed that the American military had. Robeson found out about it, and basically he denounced it and he exposed it. During that period of 48, 49, Robeson was specifically the target, together with many other people, including Leonard Bernstein and others, of counter-organizing and denunciation and slander through what was called the Congress for Cultural Freedom. He became a disappeared person, despite the fact that he had been one of the 4 or 5 most prominent actors in America, mainly Broadway, also Hollywood, having starred in what is still the longest running Shakespeare performance, I believe, to this day, which is in Othello. He was completely disappeared during the 1950s. His passport was taken, despite the fact there was no crime that was alleged against him, for 8 years. And that's sort of his history. People like William Warfield, by the way, who you just saw, who was a singer, did not only revered Robeson, but knew that their singing careers were promoted because when he was absented from the stage, Warfield in specific and others were given their careers as a way of countering or substituting, in effect, for Paul Robeson. Warfield had an extensive discussion with Robeson before he went on his career because he didn't want to, in that sense, be used against Paul Robeson. But Robeson authorized, in that sense, he gave his blessing to, I'll put it that way, Warfield to pursue his career. The history of the United States on matters of culture and on matters of freedom is a very checkered history. When you're looking at what we're talking about right now in Ukraine or anyplace else, when you look at, more importantly, the impending censorship, the censorship we're about to see in this country, it is reminiscent of what happened at that time. I think the thing that would be important for us to simply consider, in the example of Paul Robeson, who never betrayed his beliefs and always insisted that he would speak out for the rights of the poor and the underprivileged, and maintained that position until he couldn't maintain it because of his having been given 53 consecutive electroshock treatments in England after having been dosed with a drug called BZ. It was a sort of an early form of hallucinogenic. This was done by a combination of British intelligence, some people also in a certain faction in Russia. It's done in Moscow. And these are things that we know directly from his son, who's now deceased, but who gave us an interview back in 2000, where he described this to us. And so what's important, I think, for people who are watching to understand about what you've now entered into, the world you're now in, is that if you don't stand up and fight, this is the lesson to learn, and fight very, very hard right now, then in fact, you will be engulfed by the character of turmoil and despair that was characteristic of the 1930s. We can do that. We have the ability to do that, but the independent voice is the key thing. And again, coming back to the candidacy and the need for the signatures and the need to have Diane on the ballot, that's the best kind of lesson I think you can draw from the life of Paul Robeson. I invite people to, there are various things you can look at. His son did do a documentary about his father. He also wrote a 2-volume biography of his father, which you can take a look at as well.
Great. There's a question in the chat. Maybe I'll just share that. Someone asked, could Biden and Harris be mere puppets toward a globalist plan to level America of any element of power to strengthen the UN? I think that's what he says. If so, would this be a call for an isolationist mindset? Carl, do you want to say anything about that?
Can you repeat the question? I didn't really quite understand it.
Not completely clear, but I think the question is, are Biden and Harris just puppets for something else, the globalist plan for the destruction of America? Maybe the writer thinks that this is on behalf of the UN. Should we become isolationists, maybe is what they're asking.
I think, well, I don't whether or not to be isolationist is not the question. The question is how we relate to other nations. Do we relate to them as equals, as seeking mutually beneficial relationships, or do we relate to them as a hegemon, as a dominant power, which is what we've been doing, as a dominant power on behalf of the City of London and Wall Street financier interests who believe that they have the right to run the world using American military power as their tool, as their enforcement. That's the question. I don't think isolationism even enters into either of those two diametrically opposed options. Now, obviously, I'm for mutually beneficial types of relationships, like Franklin Roosevelt's good neighbor policy of the 1930s, for example, or John Quincy Adams' community of principle with sovereign nation states. That's the alternative to what we have now, and that's the way to avoid a war.
Sure. I'll just say, in terms of the electoral process, just look at what happened within the Democratic Party. I mean, somebody's definitely a puppet of somebody. You had people like Tulsi Gabbard, who mopped the floor with Kamala Harris in one of the debates, destroyed her. But the party, then you had Hillary Clinton calling Tulsi Gabbard a Russian agent, if you remember. And we had what happened in 2016. I would say Bernie Sanders is equally a puppet. And by the way, he's gung-ho supporting the Ukrainian Nazis. But he was perfectly happy to have Hillary Clinton steal the nomination from him. And you remember, while we were hearing all about the Russiagate, or Russia hacking the DNC servers, no one ever said Hillary Clinton's emails were fraudulent. They were true. But I think it's really important to remember, or to reflect on, what is the mission of mankind? What does it mean to be immortal as a species? How do we bring that about? And in that context, then, what should the role of the United States be in the world? Because our presidents, our greatest presidents, clearly had the idea that we wanted other nations to have the same kind of freedom that we had in the United States. And that means economic, it means not being subjected. You had projects like the so-called Green Revolution, which wasn't the Green New Deal. It was an idea that every single nation had a right to be food self-sufficient. And then you had the British come in and the World Trade Organization and tell countries like Haiti, oh, no, you shouldn't grow crops that you can eat. You should just produce coffee or cotton or whatever and export it, and you should buy your food from someone else 7,000 miles away. The United States right now importing food, which is absurd. So in part, you should never enter a war if you don't have a conception of what victory looks like. And I think this is one of the things that's very important for Americans. People are very angry about what they perceive as violations of their freedoms, and real violations: First Amendment rights, freedom of association, elections, etc. But how do you remedy that? And what would true freedom actually look like? And how do we get from here to there? And I think these are the things that people really have to consider.
I have one question that keeps being asked to me. I don't think everybody can see who's asking it right now, but let me just bring up an image on the screen and refer to something to get your sense of this. The International Cat Federation says it has banned Russian cats from its international competitions in the latest rebuke to Russia since it invaded Ukraine last week. The federation, which calls itself the United Nations of Cat Federations, said in a statement that it was shocked and horrified that Russian forces had invaded Ukraine and started a war. It said that the measures were decided Tuesday and officials could not, quote, witness these atrocities and do nothing, end quote. It said the rule will remain in place until the end of May and will then be reviewed. No cat belonging to exhibitors living in Russia may be entered at any show outside Russia, FIFE show, F-I-F-E, regardless of which organization these exhibitors hold their membership in. So the now unseen feline to my right is asking what your view is of this, Diane, as a candidate.
Well, I just got a news flash, which I don't fully understand, but perhaps some listeners can figure this out. It's they are holding vigils protesting the ban of Russian-bred felines versus the potential rat line surge. And it says that the noted lyric sopranos Mia Forsenati, Noah Idiota, with pianist Socrate Dia, have announced suspension of their scheduled performances of Rossini's Buffa di Due Gatti, the duet known as Meow, Meow, Meow. Flanked by teams of Siberian Huskies in solidarity, the trio read a prepared announcement of the decision. Opera goers suspect the act bears the paw print of a protest response against the blindly followed nasty pogroms against Russian artists publicized in Western media outlets this past week. Freedom-loving, conscientious performers, artists, and citizens worldwide are urged to undertake nightly vigils in front of Carnegie Hall, La Scala, and other concert venues which bend to endorse such political witch hunts. Observers caution that even a selected, targeted ban on Russian-bred felines may lead to a surge in rat lines worldwide. We certainly have big rat problems in New York, I will say, aside from the other rat lines.
Well, it should be noted that the arrangements now for running weapons into Ukraine are now being referred to as rat lines.
Frat lines.
Rat lines, yes, right. Reminiscent.
Banning of the Russian cats because obviously they're suspected of being of interfering with the running of weapons into Ukraine. Must be what it is.
Yes. So let me ask if people have closing thoughts. Carl, do you want to go ahead?
Oh, I had not prepared closing thoughts. Well, I just think people should keep in, they should have at the forefront of their minds what the real danger is, how dangerous this situation is now, and that how important it is that we act, such as with your campaign, Diane, and in general, exposing the real situation of who's behind this drive towards possibly a civilization-ending World War III.
Dennis.
As for me, my thoughts are with the cats. I think that what people should do is take a look at some of the writings of Heinrich Heinemann. Maybe we can actually post something, because you heard the song, but what you might not know about Heine as a poet is that he loved ridiculing absurdity, like the kind of thing that we are living through right now. I mean, most of it's absurd. And there are different ways of talking about it. The people who are, like, for example, the Ukrainian ambassador to Israel, who was complaining that Israel wouldn't take more Ukrainian Jews, despite the fact that during World War II, so many Jews have been saved in Ukraine by Ukrainians. But the Ukrainians who saved them are the people that lived in the East or were otherwise part of the Soviet Union, as in, the opposite of the people who are now the ambassadors who are asking for this. So you have things like this. So you have rich areas of irony that can be mined and should be mined. Because, for example, how is it that the price of gasoline here is going up, although America is actually still buying gas from Russia? But not only that, America is not dependent on Russia for gas. So why is the price up here? But yet people are saying Putin somehow caused this. When you're confronted with that kind of absurdity, what you know is at work is nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat to advance. That's what you're hearing. And so I believe that we should have people sort of revisit FDR's inaugural. I think we should post a few of Heinrich Heine's jokes and some of his poems. I think the people should consider that the cultural inferiority of the leadership of the United States and much of the transatlantic world is actually why they can't understand how to resolve an easily resolvable matter. And that the people who are driving this have another agenda which doesn't end with the thing called the shadow war called the Ukraine-Russia conflict. They are coming for everything that represents freedom, justice, and equality as we have known it in the United States. And they will get it unless our own people are able to change their culture and think outside of the box of fear that has been paralyzed their intellects at this point.
Great, thanks. I would just say that I think if people keep your wits about you, think strategically, definitely keep a good sense of humor, read Shakespeare, we're actually on the cusp of these enemies of mankind overplaying their hand, because the things they are doing are so outrageously, unbelievably over the top. That doesn't guarantee a victory. We have to really be steadfast and fight for that. And I would also encourage people to not be afraid in talking to your friends and neighbors. I've had a number of rather contentious conversations on the matter of what's happening in the world. It's worth it, because the truth is going to come out, and it's better to have told the truth. I would also like to encourage people tomorrow at 2:00. Dennis will be hosting a discussion on the LaRouche organization website. Carl also will be part of that continuation and development of some of the ideas brought up here. And finally, again, I would urge everybody, one way to ensure that the right people have the right kind of heart attacks will be to make sure that I get on the ballot in New York, which is intended not to happen. So if you are in New York, if you're not in New York, if you want to come in and help April 19th through May 31st, we need people collecting signatures, and I need funds from all American citizens and permanent legal residents. You may donate to my campaign, and it would be greatly appreciated. So thank you very much for tuning in. I hope that we are all able to be here again next Friday.